so much for that generous introduction. It's so great to be here with all of you. I think I was here like 10 years ago for something invasive species related. But it was really, really rainy and it was like in November, so it's nice to see it like this. Thank you so much for the welcome. And I was hoping today I would sort of take you on a bit of a journey of what I'm up to, how I think about things, and just show you kind of how my thinking's evolved and what's happening on land with all of my amazing grad students and the communities that we work alongside. And so the title of my talk is Relational Restoration, Reclaiming Land Responsibility and Reciprocity. We'll just get into what that looks like. So let's go to the next slide just to properly introduce myself. So my family are very much people of the canyon. So we're from both the Inclacatmic and Secwepemc nations and have many St'át'imc relatives as well. I'm a member of the Lytton First Nation, where I also serve as co-chair of our lands committee. Nobody ever really knew where Lytton was until 2021, and now more recently another fire there. So I am going to take you on to some firework that we're doing as well. And then I also like to say that I've infiltrated the academy. I identify more as a practitioner, I feel like. I had a long career working in invasive species management, which I think was one of the best jobs in the whole wide world, until I got told that I didn't have enough letters after my last name to be saying the things that I was saying. So I went back as a mature student to do my grad work and eventually finish my PhD. But through all these amazing connections, now I get to work with all these people and on research related things, all the things that we walked past as practitioners and we're like, that's weird. Now I get to go and actually see what's happening. And the next slide. So this is my lab. If you're interested in following along, we have a new blog about what we're up to, what we're looking at. And our lab works entirely in service to Indigenous communities around British Columbia. And so our projects are really different depending on where we're working, but all sort of around land healing, as well as food security. It means something different everywhere we work, but you can take a look at what we're up to there. So to get started, I think a lot of us, when we think about restoration ecology, we think about getting rid of invasive species. You can go to the next slide. And that's me in action there. I love nothing more than killing knotweed. I have to tell you, that never left me. Just had an opportunity to do a research project with a nation working on it. It fills my heart. However, we can go to the next slide. There's this formula that we all follow, right? So remove invasive species, plant native species in their place, and technically we should be returning to Eden. But I think we can go to the next slide. As all of us know, it feels a bit like this, right? And I like to say that, I spent a lot of years having volunteers, usually retired biologists, coming to help me with invasive species polls. And, we would do all this work and come back the next week. And it was like we weren't even there the week before. And that is really, we've gone too far. That is really, don't give away my thunder. That is, a really kind of problematic, frustrating thing. And that is part of why I went back to do research, is how do we stop this? How do we get people more engaged in restoration work? And how do we maybe stop whacking at symptoms and get to really what the actual problems are? Now you can go to the next slide, thanks. But one of the issues also is, and I don't know if you've heard this term before, is fortress conservation. So where, people do really dumb things in the woods. I worked on auxiliary for BC Parks for a long time. And so got a firsthand look at the silly things that people do in the woods. And so I totally understand this feeling of needing to keep people out, right? When we have these projects that we work so hard on, we don't want people trampling over top of, lighting on fire. This is, why things end up, you can go to the next slide, behind gates. Sorry, Nature Conservancy. This one really annoys me. But I understand it. A lot of work goes in, a lot of funding, and we want to keep people out. But there are a lot of issues with this. And, one story on a site that is related to this one is I got a call that said, all the camas that we've been working so hard to restore over the last 20 years is suddenly not looking so good. Can you come and have a look at it? And so out I go, and they've done the most magnificent restoration out there. Like, I laid in the flowers and listened to the bees, and it was wonderful. But when we dug up the camas, it's so crowded and crunched together because they've done too good of a job, and they didn't realize that this plant coexisted with people. It co-evolved with people. It was food. And so, of course, under long periods of drought and intense temperatures, it's not doing so well because it just it has no water, it's crowded, it needed people. And that really was like a pivotal moment for me, where we have to start kind of confronting this and finding ways to increase our relationship with place and trust people more in being part of these places. You can go to the next slide. Because also working with community, I saw this, fortress conservation play out where it's also conflicting with sovereignty rights of Indigenous peoples, where, many of our traditional harvesting areas happen to be these places that are conservancies, that are these places that are parks, because we're forced off of our traditional territories in many respects and are now getting back to some of these practices. But that's my cousin Barb on the left there with the moose that she harvested. And, in the middle, I've had the police called on me with people, out harvesting cedar because they think that we're hurting their trees. And my daughters have gotten in trouble at school for harvesting berries on a hiking trip, because they might poison themselves, we're very detached in many respects. Maybe not people that live here, because I'm sure you all live here because you like to be with the land, but there's a whole larger group of people that aren't as familiar with these things that then see what we're doing as wrong. And when really, we're actually helping, this is part of stewardship. Harvesting is part of stewardship. You can go to the next slide. And so more and more, as a restoration ecologist, you come out kind of like as this Cape Crusader to help, right? But it just happens over and over. And what are we actually seeing when we see a degraded site? And this is what has really started to shift for me. This is a Garry Oak ecosystem near Duncan on Somenos Creek, heading towards the lake, where snowberry, a native shrub species, is taking over underneath the Garry Oaks. And so we wanted to take care of the snowberry, but it's a native species. And we didn't have a regulatory pathway to actually take care of it. Because managing native species behaving invasively isn't something that we think about and isn't really something anybody wants to do. But meanwhile, an elder said to me, there's no children or grandchildren in this system because none of the young Garry Oaks can actually grow because they're being smothered by this native species. And more we're seeing these systems where this passage of time since they were actively managed, in this case with fire, right, to keep the ground open and clear, has long passed. We're at 100 to 150 years now since a lot of those stewardship practices. So it's kind of like the time's up almost for some of these systems if we're not engaging with them in the way that they used to. You can go to the next one. So this is me in angst.
For as many of you.
Why are they calling me? I don't know what to do. But it's been a really cool and humbling challenge to sort of dissect what you've learned in your education and your time on land to really reconsider, where have we gone wrong? How do we actually solve some of these problems? So go to the next slide. So meet historical ecology. There should be some kind of sound effect for this. Exactly. I was very wary of anything that had ethno in front of it, myself as an Indigenous person, and there's a lot of early ethnographers that, collected our knowledges and reported on them, and I didn't know how to feel about it. But the more I realized trying to understand those systems like that Garry Oak, how important it actually is, these accounts are. Because even in our own communities, there are gaps in knowledges because of our history where they have been saved by this kind of documentation. And how do we actually fix things if we don't understand what they were? Right. And I think this is something that I never learned about in my education, and never really used when I was a professional either. And it's not because we're trying to like go back in time. You can go to the next slide. It's just that to move forward with wisdom, we need to understand what happened. And so when I think back to people arriving at the shores, even here from a different part of the world, what did they see? Well, what they saw was a lack of productivity, right? If you just look at these woods, and like we just got back from the World Biodiversity Forum in Switzerland, you look at agro-ecosystems there, how food is produced, it doesn't look like that, right? It looks like this. And so, of course, when you arrive, you would think, gosh, this is kind of crazy. We need to start clearing land and we need to start growing food in the way that we know how. But no one really stopped to say, how do you feed yourselves here now, right? And especially one of the things people don't realize is that mostly it was men talking to men.
Yeah.
Well, the women did the plants. Well, every nation that I work with, 13 different ones, all of the stories is the women handled the plants. So there's a huge missing piece of this recognition of what food was. Slide. And so this is all, where we're confronting these misconceptions about Indigenous peoples in British Columbia in particular, where this idea that we were hunter-gatherers, roaming around, catching fish way out in the ocean and trying to find salmon berries as we might know them today. And that's just not the case. Humans are way too lazy for that, right? Like, innovations didn't start with people arriving here as newcomers. And we can look at systems today where, I didn't recognize things on our coastline. Now I see them everywhere. So like clam gardens, tidal fish traps, Wapato gardens, root gardens and estuaries. Aquaculture wasn't invented recently here, right? It's been going on for a really long time. And so it's really important for us to acknowledge this, when we're, again, trying to understand and fix systems that are struggling today. Go to the next slide. And so historical ecology is amazing. It uses multiple lines of evidence to recreate or understand the past. So I used to work in the bush by myself. Now I never go there by myself because there's no way I could know all the things that I need to know to understand what we're doing. And so, we are looking at things like ecological surveys, ethnobotanical indices. We work with archaeologists all the time. We're in the archives, and we're a pain in the butt in the archives everywhere. I feel like lately we're interviewing elders that still have memory of, what has happened. And we're looking at things like historic airfield rates even to really understand land transformation. And you can go to the next slide. And what this does, because I used to have to work with archaeological monitors all the time, and it kind of annoyed me. Like I was like, why do I have to have these people with me? I just want to do my plants, and now I would never be out there without them. Because they're just providing a context where we're even understanding what people were eating thousands of years ago on these sites. And again, it's not about us trying to go backwards. It's about us trying to go forward with wisdom and understand what's possible here and what changed to get us to where we are today. And you can go to the next slide. And this is where, spending time with elders. This is Dr. Arvin Charlie, who's Cheen from Cowichan Tribes. I've been sitting with him for over a decade. He's not sick of me yet. And Jared Williams, Postanican, if you don't know him on YouTube, he's Indigenous Forest Punk, and you should totally give him a follow. And, there's just such a wealth of information in sitting with people like this and understanding how things changed over time for them as well. You can go to the next slide. And then finally, this is just some work that I was doing with historical ecologist Chelsea Armstrong from SFU, where we were just out with an Kitsilus First Nation along the Skeena River and saw this little, you can just kind of see the ash there. There's like an ash layer that swirls, and it's an indication. I don't do this for a living, just so you know, but this is a hearth. And it got dated and it was like more than 3,000 years old. And they were super excited. I'm just like, that looks like a mark on the side of the lake, right? But what they were pulling out of there is bone fragments, seeds, and we were floating seeds here and looking through the microscope at what people were cooking 3,000 years ago. And what's crazy is it's all the things that the plants were still handling today, right? And so it's kind of like time melted away looking through that microscope, but it just made me realize like the plants that we're dealing with here have such a deep knowledge of these places where we're trying to help them, right? And there's probably way more we can learn from them than we realize. You can go to the next slide. And so all of that, understanding that deep history, is also then knowing the laws of the place, that are from the nations. When you learn our languages, you learn our laws, you learn how we name plants, how we targeted stewardship at each of those plants. And so this is from my nation at Kisquencha Temuka Kisquencha, which means take care of the land and the land will take care of you. And this is a fundamental law. And so, it just, all of this provides such important context to then know, what do we need to do? What should we be doing? What should we be thinking about? You can go to the next slide. And one of those things is understanding that pretty much everywhere in British Columbia, there's really no such thing as natural. All of these systems are shaped on purpose for very specific purposes. And I think this is where we're starting to get into trouble. I'm working on my second book right now about how our ecosystems have become so simplified by things like forestry that they catch on fire. Right? Where we're losing this diversity that was driven by human disturbance, but good disturbance. And so we have to be thinking about our lands as these mosaics, because that is what they were. And that is what we are slowly losing. And you go to the next slide. That we're really lucky that there are still places that kind of give us hints and show us what was, so that we know what could be. And so this is a forest garden at Kitsillas First Nation at Gitxav, and it's 5,000 years old. And in the forest garden is you can go to the next slide, is a completely different ecosystem than the neighboring coniferous forest. So this is about 100 meters away. I'm sorry, it's so bright in here you can't see, but the plant community and the community structure is so different. The canopy is not closed in. There's hazelnuts, apples, there's rice fruit, there's blueberry, there is just this high density of food plants everywhere that you look. And then in the neighboring forest, there's nothing. So it just really gives us this idea that, people were out there changing what's out there. And I feel like that's something that we don't do today. We feel a bit like we're on an environmental ecology tour and we're just trying to kind of, sorry, and just put things back. But we're not having that relationship. We're not giving ourselves that agency that, in creating systems like this, as an example, we had wildlife cameras in here, this is where all the animals are coming to feed. Yeah. And in my own stories from my nation and this nation as well, they made gardens for the animals. And not just because feeding them is the right thing to do, but because reciprocity, and because also humans are lazy. If you're hunting, are you going to go chasing the animals, or are you going to invite them into where you want to harvest them and keep an eye on them and know which one you're going to take, because that's how you're managing also the population. And again, I think this is where we're like, don't feed wildlife. And my elders are like, we had entire mountains to feed the wildlife, right? So why are they hungry? Well, we can go to the next slide. So I just want to take you on some of our research projects to kind of understand why this is all important, this context, understanding historical ecology, what was, understanding our laws and our languages, is that it just really helps us to see the landscapes differently. And that I think is making our restoration work so much better. And we're seeing that even in our own data. So this is the Fraser River. This is just north of Lillooet. We can go to the next slide. And this is a familiar scene on the news, but this is the McKay Creek wildfire that started the day after the heat dome in 2021. So the Lytton fire started the day after this one. And it burned 46,000 hectares, which is the size of the city of Toronto, or 83,000 football fields. Just to help you understand, it takes us about 5 hours to drive from one side of the fire to the other. Go to the next slide. And this is where I started. So I'm not a fire ecologist. That's my colleague Lori Daniels, who I think was here last year, and I was just in Switzerland with. But I was asked by my cousins to come and help. One of my cousins is the chief up here. It looks like the moon, Jen. Surely you know what to do. Come. No one taught me what to do about this. This has been a very humbling experience, but one, again, where we're really understanding that what has happened over the last 150 years is we're in a reckoning of that time. Mm-hmm. So just to help you understand how things have changed there, you can go to the next slide. This is Chatelaine territory, and those are the fires from 1900 until 2000 in the yellow polygons. You can go to the next slide. And the red polygons are the fires from the last 23-ish years. And you can see they're much bigger. There are just as many. And interestingly enough, they're all concentrated where forestry happens. And so, you know, we have transformed our landscapes, and we're now kind of paying the price for that. You can go to the next slide. So when I first started on the fire, that devastating landscape shot, you know, what do? This is the edge of the fire, an unburned area. And I used to drive out here as my thinking spot. And I'd be like, have that kind of, you know, on our license plate, like, beautiful British Columbia, right? Like just, but now you can go to the next slide. I have learned that this is not beautiful British Columbia. This is horrifying. This is supposed to be a fire adapted, open ponderosa pine forest. Not a monotypic stand of interior Douglas fir where you walk in and there is no life. It is brown, it is dead. And then on the right there we have grasslands that are totally invaded by sagebrush. And again, this is like the problem of shifting baselines, right? Where what we are born with and what we see, we think normal conditions. And this is what is so important if you're doing conservation, if you're doing restoration ecology, that this shifted baseline of normal is not what we're trying to get back to. Otherwise, we're going to keep having fires or things are going to keep dying. We have to work together to construct what is a reasonable baseline for now, you know, and it might not be the same as it was, but we have to acknowledge that, you know, because I was getting told when we were running our experiments, that's your control. That's what you're going to compare all of your experiments against. We were looking at what happens to the vegetation after wildfire. And I said, no, that's not a baseline. That's the problem, right? But this is what my pals in science, you know, right? Without having that understanding of historical ecology. You can go to the next slide. And so this is where working together with community is so incredibly important. I say I get a new education every time I'm in a truck with land guardians. They know their lands best, they know their history best, they know what's happening out there right now to the hot minute. And it's not just land guardians that are like that. It's people that I meet too that are in conservancies like you, right? People that walk their dogs in the same place every 20 years. All types of knowledges are so important, where if outsiders are coming in, they need to be informed by the people that know the lands best. And so you can go to the next slide. So, you know, we're working on understanding what plants come back after wildfire, because nobody really knows after this kind of catastrophic fire. But I'm not going to get into that. And we have a bunch of papers you can read about it, and I'll have a new book soon that you can read about that too. You can go to the next slide. But there are other values on the landscape too that people aren't aware of, right? So in this case with fires, you know, people think loss of homes, you know, maybe wildlife death, loss of forest, but also for us, the cultural impacts are really significant. So remains of our ancestors are just on the surface now because the soil's burned up. Archaeology sites are totally exposed instead of hidden in the forest now. And so, you know, there's these other values on the landscape that we care about. And the next slide is really important, is recognizing that the work that we're doing is food systems. It might not be for us, it might be for birds, it might be for other wildlife, but it really should be for us as well. And you can go to the next slide. And these are just reminders that others live out here when we're making decisions about land. And I just wanted to show you really quickly about how the science changes when you apply this kind of lens. So you can go to the next slide. We did a vegetation study looking at what came back after the wildfire at low, medium, and high severity fires, and whether there used to be invasive species there as well. And our results came back. The blue bars are all native plants. This is the second year after the fire. And there's about 25% or higher native plants came back after that severe fire 2 years later. The province came out and they said, oh, that's pretty good. Like, we should be happy with that. The rest is all bare ground. We're like, oh, okay, I guess so, right? They're like, yeah, compared to other fires, that's really great. We're not going to do any interventions out there. We're not going to seed. We're not going to plant. We can go to the next slide. But the land guardians and hunters, indigenous and non-indigenous, said, no way, that data does not match what's out there. And so what we did is, understanding historical ecology, working with community, we decided we're going to change how we analyze this data. We're going, instead of using plant classifications that are normal, like native and non-native, we're going to make the plant classifications more specific. We are worried about what's happening with mule deer out there on the landscape. Are they starving? So we're going to put a list together of what do they eat out there. And the provincial government said, well, you don't need to do that. We have our own list. So we said, okay, well, let's see your list. And we look at their list, and all the hunters, indigenous and not, were like, they don't eat that. So we made our own list. We also did it for culturally important plants and stuff. But I just want to draw your attention just quickly to this, is that this is what the mule deer actually eat, and they have less than 7.5% forage out there. So the conventional way of doing science, of understanding the land, kind of lied to us, or didn't give us a complete picture. But when we had more knowledge and understanding, and we're willing to kind of do things a bit differently, we can see that we can get a clearer picture of what's happening out there, and then we can target our interventions. We do need to get food out there for those mule deer. So where are we going to do it? Right. So this is just what I wanted to show you, is there's just so much power in having this more complete picture, so that we have such limited resources in this game, right? Limited people power. So we need to be able to target what we're doing, with data-driven approaches that, I'm sorry to say, the provincial government does not have. You can go to the next slide. Also, we need to recognize too that these kinds of disturbances are really important. It's not all bad news, right? So the fires, this is a grassland where the fire came through at low and moderate intensity, and it cleaned up all the tree encroachment. Actually, all these trees coming down the hill, they're now all dead and gone. The big sagebrush is gone. There's so much plant diversity in there. You could teach an ethnobotany class standing still. So I just wanted to put that there too, is that, it's not all bad news. And more to the next slide, that when people see this slide, they often see like, wow, like this is 4 years after the fire, everything is dead. Like, that is so horrible. Nothing's come back. We can go to the next slide. But really, actually, what's happened is forestry got cleaned up. And this is a historic berry gathering area. And this was last summer. And everybody that's on that hill, my dog included, are filling their faces with berries. Like every species of berry you could think of is just everywhere across the land. So those root banks and seed banks made it through 2 generations of forestry and that mega fire to say, hey, remember? Right. And so now we're working on establishing berry protection area as a recognized a management area in the province. It's been done now up north, but these are the kinds of creative solutions too, where we say, we want this value on the land. We don't want something else. And we're in a food security crisis. People should be able to come up here, whoever they are, and harvest this food. Right. So I hope I can plant that seed here with you today, is that we need to be thinking about how we want access to land as taxpayers, right? That we have a right to have, why not have food tenures, right? So we're going to skip, in the interest of time, through some really cool pictures of the berries, because I love plants. Stop there. Go back one. or no, go forward one, sorry. That, there we go, okay. But I think the thing that's really important to understand is that ongoing stewardship is really important. And so one of the things that's happening, and as an example in these berry areas, is that we have a ton of fir seedlings coming up everywhere. And again, like this is where modern environmentalism and like the education that I've received is like plant, plant, plant. That's what we do. But the last 2 summers, I've spent a whole bunch of time on my hands in these unplanting trees.
Right.
Because this area is very highly used by wildlife. We've got cameras up there. They are enjoying this resurgence of berries. Like this is where we have a job to maintain these mosaics on the landscape, that it's not all just forest. And that it's still psychologically, I still feel like, sorry, right? You know, but this is what we have to be prepared to confront in ourselves, in understanding that having closed canopy, you know, is just another way of smothering landscape. It just takes longer. So I just want to, if you go 2 slides ahead where there's seeds in my hand, you can, yeah, so, no, one more, that's, yeah. So a big piece of what we're doing in our lab now is understanding germination requirements for native plants. We also really take native plants for granted because they're just there, right? But there's a lot that we don't know. You know, what kind of dormancy requirements they have, what temperatures for germination work or don't work. I mean, go to the next slide. So we're doing that across the province with a number of different nations, you know, doing work in growth chambers. All the plants are labeled in the proper language, which I kind of love. And we're just reporting back to where we do want to get these understory plants back out there, we can. And we're working really hard, you can go to the next slide, to engage youth and community in those events. So one of the things that we're doing right now is making seed balls. So this is to help with the McKay Creek wildfire, but we've done this elsewhere. Kids love mud. I don't know how much their teachers love, but they love mud. But they're very engaged in this. And so we have egg cartons and, you know, they make their little mud balls, and then we've collected seed on the land and they're putting seed in, closing them up. And then we go out to a spot and they're hucking them out there. We were gonna let them use slingshots, but the teachers said no. But it's such a simple thing. But then when we went out to monitor, we had such an incredible success. We had such a high germination rate. And suddenly now every time we're coming to town to do research, there's a community event and the kids all look forward to it. And I think we have to think about the next generation of volunteers, right? You know, and I think this is how we address that issue. So I just want to, again, in the interest of time, skip ahead to the estuary slide. So I just wanted to, I know that you probably have an interest in what is happening maybe over in the Cowichan Estuary. If you're familiar with our project over there with the Nature Trust of BC and Cowichan tribes. It's been in the news a little bit. We've ruffled some feathers. But this estuary is an absolutely incredible place. The most sort of intact portion of it is on reserve kind of island north. And we are working on revitalizing the food growing areas out there. So there's a lot of camas out right in the like growing in salt brackish water, which we never knew it did. And now we're working to understand that. But there's hectares and hectares of it solid out there. And the elders told us like these were patches, part of the seasonal round, where you'd start harvesting up in the Gary Oak meadows, and then you would be coming down into the wetlands when it's, you know, hot in the summer. And so this project on the far side, where you can kind of see the farmland, the farm belongs to Nature Trust of BC. The dikes are 2 kilometers of dikes are being removed to allow inundation of water again because the dikes are failing. There's salt intrusion, and then also now there's these big rain events and all the water's coming down really quickly thanks to forestry. And then it gets held back like a bathtub instead of letting it go out to the ocean. So this should alleviate that. There'll be rechanneling, so it'll look a little bit more like this. So what happened was I got called, you can go 2 slides down, 3 slides down. That's right here. So I got called by Nature Trust because I've been working with them for a long time, and they're like, we're gonna do this restoration project. And so we're gonna make it look like the estuary over there. And I said, yeah, but it's an intertidal food system for Cowichan tribes. They said, what? And so that began their journey into historical ecology as an organization, where, you know, we helped them through archival work, where early surveyors actually wrote like Cowichan gardens on the estuary, potato growing, like it's all handwritten by their early surveyors. And so, you know, we've done a really extensive job in that research to reconstruct what that system was and to have it come back to life. So it was a near miss almost, right? I mean, it would have been a great restoration project regardless, but now all these food systems are embedded in this plan. And so you go to the next slide, we've now put a 5-acre plant nursery in there because, as I'm sure many of you know, it's very limited to be able to purchase native plants, especially on a 100-acre site that we need to plant out. So we decided, okay, we're gonna start our own nursery. We wanna have plants with the provenance that they're from this area anyways. And you can go to the next slide. And so we started planting it out in a few different phases. And in the beginning, we could only get like a few volunteers. And the most recent one that we had more than 100. And what's happened is a community has built around this place that I never anticipated. You can go to. So this is just, we've got plants labeled. You can go to the next one. So we're having these root camps, and so community members can come. Some of them we open up to everybody else. We've had more than 500 people come through the site in the last year. And I'm telling you, my core students were knocking on doors trying to get individuals to come in the beginning. But I think what's happened is we've started to, you can go to the next slide, we've started to harvest plants. We've had a feast there. We are sharing seeds that we've harvested from there. And there's more incentive to come, right? Is that when we don't leave humans out, we don't fence them out, but instead almost fence them in, you know, they want to be part of it. And I think that's been really transformative on this project where I don't have this worry, you can go to the next slide, that we're not gonna have people, you know, that all the 7 retired biologists are gonna pass away and there's gonna be nobody, you know, but because that's always been my worry. But now we have engagement from all ages and this awesome sort of intergenerational transfer of knowledge. And kids who are so bored, you know, it started and now they're just loving getting in there and asking how they can volunteer over the summer when they're off, and you can go through some of these pictures. So yeah, so we have kiddos and we're doing language classes out there. And then we had the feast out there, where one of the elders told us, you know, this is the first time we've had a feast here in 125 years. Wow. And we harvested plant foods from the space. And yeah, now in our just coming up on first year, we're harvesting propagules and seeds and storing those seeds. And so I guess I just want to wrap up by saying like this problem of like, how do we get people engaged and involved in all of that is that if we take this historical ecology perspective and think about how do we get people back onto land again, that the people, the relationships are just as important as what plants are there or aren't there. Yeah. You know, and how do we make sure that these projects last beyond all of us? And I think it's just by creating this strength of relationship. And I never learned that in restoration ecology. I feel like I do more work with people now than with plants. And the more I work with people and find out ways, like we're building a modular commercial kitchen on this site now, for community members to be able to come and process their foods, not even necessarily from here, but anywhere. And again, it's going to be open to everybody. You know, it's that we're finding out what the real problems are for people to access food or to become engaged in these kinds of things. And the barriers are things that we never really expected, you know, like people need transportation to get there, or they would love to go harvesting, but they have nowhere to store the stuff that they harvest, you know, like, and we're able to now kind of, our projects are including all these elements again that aren't just native plants or how do we just get rid of the biomass from weeds, but instead it's like, how do we feed everybody here? How do we create other events that work alongside this that are drawing people to place? So I hope just taking you around and showing you kind of what we're engaged in and how we think about things a little bit differently, you know, might give you some license or freedom to reimagine spaces, to think about how you can have, you know, more people involved in what you're working on. I'll just go to the last slide there. So I just want to thank all the nations. We're right now working in 13 different communities. And so all those knowledges are collections from everywhere. And then the final slide there is the shameless self-promotion part. But if you want to know a little bit more about how I think, and I know that was very dense, I'm sorry, but I just, yeah, you know, this is sort of talks about my professional unraveling in many respects and kind of finding my way into working like this, but I would never change any of it for a minute, because a little bit of humility has gone a long way in trying to work with community, which is really what restoration ecology is about. So yeah, so thank you so much, and well,